Hello, I'm Corina Rebeja, and I'm the Director for Democratic Resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, in Washington, D.C. Welcome to our conversation looking at disinformation from Russia and China and Central and Eastern Europe, and how this threat has evolved. This discussion is part of a week-long series that CEPA has put together to highlight the current disinformation landscape in Central and Eastern Europe and how external and homegrown disinformation has adapted to take advantage of the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm joined today by three excellent experts, all CEPA fellows, and I'm very grateful that they took the time to discuss these topics with us. And I'm going to briefly introduce them, although I know they need no introduction. So I'll go in alphabetical order. Dalia Bankauskaitė, who's a fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program and has extensive experience in studying strategic and implementing projects on strategic communication, combating Russian disinformation, working with different levels of policy making authorities on these issues. Also, I'm joined by Maryia Sadouskaya-Komlach, and I hope I pronounced the name correctly, who is a media development expert with extensive experience, again, working with journalists, looking at the challenges that they face and the threat of disinformation and how it develops in Europe, but also in Central Asia. And not least, Péter Krekó, who is the director of Political Capital Institute in Budapest, also with extensive experience studying populism, democratic backsliding in the region, and foreign authoritarian influence. So as you can see, we have a great panel to go over some of the pressing issues that are facing our democracies today. I would like to invite our speakers to delve a little bit more into how this space has evolved, how the threat is challenging, and what can be learned from the countries of Central and Eastern Europe as we look at how we can anticipate and combat these challenges and threats. So I'd like to first turn to Dalia, because the Baltic states have been so long exposed to this and have been a preferred ground for Russian interference in the past 30 years and longer. And to share a little bit about what's new, how is this landscape changing, and what can we learn from Baltic resilience? Dalia, over to you.
Corina, thank you very much. And it's really a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. And while thinking what I should say during this conversation, this dialogue, first of all, about Baltic states, I think it's a big success story for Lithuania and for other two Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, the strategic communication activities. I think why? Because three Baltic states were constantly exposed to aggressive activities of Russia, from Russia. So to some extent, when the malign activities, malign communication activities started, disinformation started, or information warfare started, starting with the war in Ukraine, aggression against Ukraine, Baltic states were prepared, or at least were not surprised, and actually took the blow. So what we have now allows us, I can really go and share more insights, but I think the two things that we learned is that one thing is countering disinformation. It is a very important it is a very important factor to be prepared to counter disinformation. But it will be always reactive, just the very term says, countering. What is more important, to be proactive. And this is not about symmetric, it is not about linear response, it's really to have your own story to tell. And there are so many stakeholders that should be employed and engaged. So the key things, what should be done, as I said, in parallel in spotting, identifying, coping, adapting, and then recovering from information operations. We have also to think about how to be proactive. One thing is close cooperation at the national level, interinstitutional cooperation. Another thing is close cooperation, collaboration with the civic society. The gap between the state institutions and the civic society should be as narrow as possible. We should close this gap. And then also to be not only locally, be active locally, telling your own story, narrative to have as a nation country, but also to think more and more on an international, regional and international level, because that should be your mindset as such. So Corina, in a nutshell, later on I'll be happy to go into details. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. And I think you made an important point to start off our conversation about turning the lens the other way from sort of the enemy or the threat actor towards ourselves. And I think that really brings a very important point forward, talking about how we prepare to different type of challenges, no matter where they come from. And I would like us to come back to how you see the Russian threat evolving, and also what other actors you are noticing in the Baltic states. But perhaps I can move on to Péter and get his view of Central and Eastern Europe, Central European region, and Hungary in particular. I think there's a slightly different set of challenges that we are seeing in this region, and we'd love to hear from you, Péter.
Thank you very much, Corina, and thank you for having me on this event. And yes, when talking about Central and Eastern Europe, I think Dalia's approach on that, let's talk not only about the threat, but what is the counter narrative. And I think the feature of Central Eastern Europe, if we consider it from social psychological aspect, is that in many countries, there is still a feeling of this in-betweenism, that we are between the East and the West, while the Central Eastern European countries, for example, the Visegrad states, are both EU and NATO member states. Still, there is a sentiment that Central Eastern European citizens are not treated the same way in the European Union than the Western citizens, and that we are just some kind of second-hand members of the Western alliances. And this is a sentiment that is easy to be exploited by nationalist politicians, and it's easy to be exploited by foreign malign actors such as Russia and China. The threat of Russian disinformation, I think, is really different than what we can see in the Baltic states. Central Eastern European countries do not share a border with Russia, with the exception of Poland in Kaliningrad. But the nature of the threat is a bit different. There is a very important buffer country, on the other hand, which is Ukraine. And Russian disinformation traditionally, and especially since 2014, is really strongly tries to turn nationalist forces in Central Eastern Europe against Ukraine and whip up secessionist sentiments in order to make these countries as actors in destabilization of Ukraine. I would say with highly limited success, but still this is a very concentrated effort, and we can see some impact of that. What is usually also a difference between the Baltic states and Central Eastern Europe is that the Russian population in the region is almost negligible, or it's pretty low. So it means that the tactics that Russia likes to use in countries where there is a sizable Russian population are rather lacking here, and also direct media influence, Russian and even Chinese media influence, is rather low in Central Eastern Europe. What is a problem, though, is that Russia is quite successful, and increasingly China as well, to find local politicians to amplify its messages, to find local media to amplify its messages. And I think the threat of state-sponsored disinformation that is amplifying Western messages is increasingly a problem, especially in Hungary, where we can see the most centralized media landscape in the whole European Union. But we can also see, I would not say it's a pro-Russian, but we can see state-sponsored disinformation increasingly in Poland as well, and increasingly in Slovenia as well. And I think this is clearly a danger. So less the direct influence, but rather this kind of indirect influence aiming to reach domestic political goals. And we prepared a study at Political Capital a few years ago with regional partners, where we found two important feelings that can be easily exploited by disinformation from foreign actors, either directly or indirectly. Insecurity and inferiority. Insecurity in the sense that there are fears that even if we are members of the Western alliances, Russia is simply too close. Will the NATO really defend us if there is a danger? These are questions that are being raised in not only in the Baltic states but in Central Eastern Europe as well, and also insecurity at the moment because of the pandemic, and also which results in a willingness, and it's clearly visible in the case of Hungary these days, to reach out more to Eastern partners, Russia and China, that they should help us if the West is slow in response, as we can see right now with the vaccine rollout, where we can see real problems as in the European Union in distribution of the vaccines. So this insecurity is one feeling. The other one is inferiority. So that, as I said, Central Eastern Europe is not an equal player in the European Union to the Western mates. And this kind of inferiority can be easily exploited again by authoritarian messaging. And what is, I think, very spectacular these days in Central Eastern Europe is what I call authoritarian inflation. That China and especially Russia tries to look bigger, stronger than in reality. We did a poll in Hungary that showed that the economic strength, the military strength, and political influence of Russia is highly exaggerated in the perceptions, which means that, and if this is a perception, it can finally become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you feel that China and Russia are the leaders of the world tomorrow, then it makes sense to make alliances with them. It makes sense to sacrifice some of your, let's say, Western diplomatic contacts on the altars of reaching out to the East. And I think it's a false perception. But this kind of decline of the West narrative, it is increasingly strong in Central Eastern Europe. And this is what is very visible right now at the pandemic. And the mass diplomacy and the vaccine diplomacy aims to just amplify that by Russia and China. And I think this is the biggest problem to target these days. We can remind ourselves that Edward Spengler wrote his book, The Decline of the West, 100 years ago. And his prophecy on the decline of the West proved to be wrong, but still this sentiment is pretty much around, and this is something that can bring a lot of benefits economically and even in terms of narratives to authoritarian superpowers.
Thank you, Péter. I think your conclusion is pretty chilling, but thank you for raising the point about what makes societies vulnerable or susceptible. Because I think that has been a major question in the research about disinformation and why it works. And I think if we read the GlobSec surveys in the past few years, we already see that decline and that ambiguity about where people think they can place themselves on the geopolitical spectrum and where they might think the dangers or the support might be coming from. And I think we can come back to that with all of our speakers later on. And of course, this question of proxies and who's an enabler, I think that's crucial all over the world, really. But I would like to turn to Maryia as well, because her geographical area of focus is slightly different, and I'm wondering if also the threats are different. And Maryia, you recently wrote a piece about Belarus and how Russia is using Belarus to reinforce certain narratives, but also sort of turn some of the existing narratives around. And I'd like to hear your take on how this threat of disinformation from Russia, but also from China and other actors, is playing out in Belarus and sort of in the Eastern Partnership countries and even Central Asia. And thank you.
Well, I feel so lucky. Péter spoke only about Hungary, and now I have this only 10-something countries to cover in one go. But I'll do my best. So I'm a Belarusian myself, and therefore, indeed, I'm kind of following the Russia's narratives in my home country almost since birth. And what I actually wrote for SIPA recently, that Russia, of course, tries to spread narratives inside Belarus, such as, for example, that both Navalny and opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya are the same puppets of the West, and they all both are Nazis, and even Belarus state media are spreading caricatures showing them on the laps of Hitler. But I think it's not the most important message or narrative that Russia is actually spreading, or I would want to say Kremlin, because all my independent journalists and activists in Russia are always very offended when we put the equal sign between Russia and Kremlin. So what is Kremlin trying to send as a message? First of all, that authoritarianism is cool, you're respected, Josep Borrell is coming to talk to you, and then we just heard from CDU that Navalny's poisoning or arrest is not a reason to stop the Nord Stream. So actually, this is something that both Russia and China, which has an EU-China summit today, right, or the 17+1 China summit today, is sending. Authoritarianism is cool. If you're strong enough, then you can actually put people into prison, and the big states will still consider you an important player. Then, as Péter mentioned as well, it also uses the so-called vaccine diplomacy, or let's say technological advancement diplomacy, which the Soviet Union used to actually apply as well for a long time during the Cold War. It basically shows that authoritarian states are also more efficient when it comes to technological solutions. And while it's not true, and we people in the region know that for one such great breakthrough as a Sputnik vaccine, which is actually considered to be a legit vaccine, there are a lot of mishaps and a lot of things that do not work properly on the middle level. It is still, I think, a diplomacy that works, especially in cases like Ukraine, where the government went so harsh against Sputnik and its possible applicability, and even the media, like Medvedchuk's media, that were promoting Sputnik, among other things, that now it's actually getting criticized, including internationally, for not paying enough attention to its citizens. And here is actually what is the third message that both Russia and China have been spreading in the region, is actually that the West cares less about people living there than the so-called authoritarians. And you can see it in many narratives. Both Russia and China have been promoting their humanitarian aid missions, China to Africa, but also Central Asia, Russia to Central Europe, Eastern Europe. Belarus was the first country where Russia actually agreed to send its vaccine before it even was released, right? And it was announced publicly. So they also kind of ask people to use their critical thinking and to see what the West does in this regard. And what we hear from the European Union, that Denmark is going to ban selling vaccines to the third countries before it vaccinates all its people, right? Or that there are shortages, that there is a competition for AstraZeneca or Pfizer. So Russia and China both skillfully use this willingness of people in this region also to have someone who would care about this paternalistic approach, where the nation is still expecting much more social guarantees from the states than many states are able to give them. And maybe the last point I want to make, I heard from Péter a very good analysis about the feelings of insecurity and inferiority. But I also think that in some cases, Russia is using a very big, or let's say Kremlin is using a very big vulnerability that we all have, which is deficiencies in education and critical thinking. And not only of common people, let's say so, school children or university students, but unfortunately media or people who are considered as expert think tankers and so on. The scientific topics that both Russian and Chinese governments are choosing to manipulate people's opinion are so complex for media to even start deciphering that only maybe a handful of them worldwide are actually able to properly report on vaccines, on coronavirus, on the consequences of the whole pandemics for the populations, on what the measures means. So actually one of the proactive steps that we should all take, and maybe it's a bit easier in the Russian, so-called Russian-speaking region, is actually to restore the link between the expert communities, media, educators, to create a class of those who would be able to proactively analyze, critically analyze things that are done in healthcare and in science. And this, to me, is a midterm to long perspective, which will not, if we do not do something in this, then we will see actually the explosion of science-related fakes, malign information, and information actions.
That's a great point, and thank you, Maryia, for bringing that up. I think 2020, answered our question about whether disinformation has offline effects, and it does, and it impacts people's health and lives in the end. I took note of something you said, which I think resonates with what Péter was saying about how authoritarianism is cool. And how Péter referred to it as authoritarian inflation and the role of perception, and how Russia and China have really worked hard to instill that perception that they are the saviors, the interveners, the actors able to deal with crisis and to respond to these feelings of insecurity and inferiority. And I'd like to delve a little more in this topic and perhaps turn to Dalia a little bit and see if, Dalia, if your analysis of the Baltic states, if you're seeing similar phenomena, and if then this threat, if you're seeing it as the same in other countries that we've discussed. It seems to me like the pandemic was a great equalizer from the perspective of disinformation and foreign influence. But I was wondering what your take is. I think we're used to seeing the Baltic states a little bit more resilient. Where do you see the vulnerabilities?
Corina, thank you for the question and for the point. I think that pandemics really equalized, got better understanding, and understanding that there's a need to act and to be proactive, and proactive not symmetrically, but really looking inwards. Talking about Baltics information space, what's very clear that there's need of further research or assessment of the effect of countering disinformation, whether it is disinformation on historical narratives or social exclusion issues or COVID-19 narratives, but still assessment how effective is countering disinformation on its own. Another thing is important to realize, and that's what's going on, that there's a very similar pattern of malign information operations. Either it is run by China or by Russia, maybe because they are of similar regime, because they come from the same school, but the pattern is the same. So perhaps it's a good message for those who are working and really thinking and acting how to counter, how to cope with the insecurities that are jabbed into the society. one more factor and a very clear understanding is that there's no information operations as such. We have to, alone in isolation, we more and more have to think about info cyber operations and even in a more complex way. And that's when we acknowledge that. So that's comes. Then you already know kind of you get an idea what solutions could be. We also have to understand that the fragmentation of perceptions of threats and risks and management will remain, because as Joseph Borrell's visit press conference with Lavrov showed, the perception of threats and the backgrounds that people come and are capable of reacting are so different. So it's really, I'm a person of action. So it's, instead of only admiring the problem and describing all these shades, which are very important, I still think immediately what should be, how we can cope. And what Maryia says, she's absolutely right. We have to be more consolidated in tackling the issues. But I always ask leadership. Who is going to take the leadership? Otherwise, the ball will be so round that you can't, to hold it in your hand. So it's really about leadership and understanding. Good about Baltic states is, and especially what I see in Lithuania, that this political benefits, long-term political benefits are prevailing against short-term benefits of business ties with China or Russia, etc. So it's like, it's not only that it's not popular among politicians, not a single political party who openly supporting the pro-Kremlin or Chinese narratives could be elected to the parliament. It's not popular. It's just that's the society's mood today. But that should be somehow educated, trained. I mean, politicians, decision makers, of course, have to have enough of tools to be aware that that, as I said, it's short-term benefits are not long-lived. It's not, it's not popular or would not lead anywhere. So this is the tendencies in Lithuania and in Baltic states. And what another tendency is that step by step in Baltics we start talking about psychological defense. It's not about really strategic communication, which is important, and there's no communication for the sake of it. But it is really, strategic communication is the means to achieve certain goals. It's about state crafting. And psychological defense, it's more inclusive, and it's really focusing of preparing your society to cope, to adapt, and to recover from malign activities, whether inside or outside threats. So these are the approaches that, again, Baltics understand very well, that we cannot cope alone. So we look closely to the Central Eastern Europe. We look to our neighbors, Nordic countries. We talk about the security around the Baltic Sea region. So these are the tendencies of our thinking. We watch closely, not only watch. We I don't know how to say diplomatically, but we follow closely Belarus events. Half of the region of Lithuania is exposed to Lukashenko's TV broadcast, to all these narratives. And I really kind of I really acknowledge the professionalism of Belarus national TV in I say propaganda, disinformation, but for somebody it is information. How professional they are in doing that, how professional they are in explaining what's happening in the streets, telling Lukashenko's narrative. And you can see the strong school of the pro-Kremlin media. So there are, as I said, there are on the tactical, operational level things, but it's so important to know where you want to be, strategically. So psychological defense is a solution or a trend for countering disinformation, today's disinformation.
Thank you, Dalia. That reminds me of a concept that Rand launched a few years ago of cognitive security, and I think this is in line with what we're saying. But I want to go back to something you mentioned, and this was, the big news about Joseph Borrell going to Moscow and being trolled at an epic level. And this speaks to the leadership and the difference in threat perception and what we might expect from Western European partners and also the EU. And I want to ask Maryia and Péter to briefly try to answer this question. What needs to happen at an EU level that would support domestic levels to combat authoritarian influence from your perspective? Péter, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Corina. I think it's a crucial question, and I'm also happy that Dalia raised this issue of the visit of Joseph Borrell to Moscow, because I think it was symptomatic of the problem. That's why we talk a lot about, Russian influence in eastern part of Europe. We tend to ignore that this is a huge problem in Western Europe as well. And of course, Russia as an economic player, and even China as an economic player, is less important compared to the size of the bigger Western economies. But this kind of sentiment that we should stop this Cold War logic in bashing Russia and go back to business as usual, and this is the normalcy. This is quite mainstream opinion in Western Europe, and unfortunately in the last 4 years, because of the increasing tensions between the European Union and the United States, this kind of logic, I think, have rather been amplified. And I think, to your question, Corina, what should be done? I think there would be 2 moves that would already have quite a lot within the European Union. First of all, strengthening the role of the European Parliament. We have done a study with Political Capital Institute, and what we found is that the European Parliament is far the most hawkish institution and the most principled when it comes to foreign malign influence of Russia, of China, and other authoritarian superpowers, but also when it comes to raising the voice over human rights violations. And we can have some hope that in the current situation, the European Parliament will, for example, soften or make it more conditional the agreement that is going on between China and the European Union, because it also seems that the pragmatic logic that is the core logic of the European Commission seems to be more important than the principles of taking into consideration the human rights violations in even the most important economic partners. And so this is one thing. The other thing I think would be important is to abolish the principle of anonymity when it comes to decisions in the European Council in foreign policy issues. And luckily, the Russia sanctions are an exception, because many member states would like to abolish them, but still the consensus is kept within the European Union. But for example, there was no joint resolution of the European member states because of the crackdown after the Navalny protests by Russia because of one member state, Hungary, that vetoed this decision. There were many resolutions that were not passed against China and its human rights abuses and its influence because of member states such as Greece and Hungary. So it would be quite important as well. And I think to claim something more optimistic as well, but very slowly, I think the threat perception in the whole overall European Union is rather on the rise against Russia, against China, even if some issues like this Borrell visit shows a different picture. And I think it's quite important for the United States as well to think about the European Union as a possible partner in pushing back Russian and Chinese influence. I think the European Union as a whole is more resistant to these influences than the member states and the member states separate.
Thank you, Péter. Great point about the veto powers and about the European Parliament and its role. And I think it's becoming a more visible institution in very crucial points, including on foreign policy. But turning to Maryia, and the same question about expectations from the EU or what the EU might do.
Well, the question is whom the EU can influence. Can it influence Putin, even if it becomes really strong and unanimous in its decisions? Possibly, dependent, of course, also on the US role and the transatlantic leadership on that, because I think one key element that is missing in the EU response is actually America. The Trump administration was not the leader in undertaking any joint actions, although the administration did support certain measures against authoritarian regimes. But one other thing that the European Union can influence much easier than Putin is its own membership and its own population. And I feel it's a bit mistaken to actually just say we don't want to vote unanimously anymore because some members will always behave less democratically, and not to actually delve into how to really apply efficiently the rule of law clause towards the governments that violate it, or how to deal with civic education so that the voters in certain EU member states do not actually demand from their elected officials to continue doing business with Russia as usual. Or also how to actually deal with politicians who are anti-Kremlin, like Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland, and who repeat all the xenophobic and all the intolerant statements and myths that Kremlin propaganda does. He doesn't even have to be the Kremlin proxy. So my conclusion is that the European Union, if it does its homework properly, it can actually have this long-term change towards this important international player that it can still become.
Thank you, Maryia. That's a great point, and thanks for mentioning the US. And this is what I would like us to end on, maybe a 30-minute sort of capstone recommendation from you to this new administration in Washington, DC, that seems to be on not just seems to be, is radically different than what we have seen in the past 4 years. And there's a lot of hope that there will be firmer action towards Russia and China. So what would be your thoughts about what this new administration in Washington should do, very briefly? Dalia, over to you.
Mm-hmm. When you say the United States, I immediately think about the image, and can't remember the source, but the image of the US in Europe is really record low, below 30% popularity. So it's really low. So a lot of things should be done. And first of all, it's focus. Keep the focus. For the last 4 years, there was no real clear message or of concentration. It was not clear where the states were leading to. So I would immediately think of rethinking and designing a public diplomacy strategy. And when I say strategy, it's not something, it's really action plan, knowing very clearly where you want to be. There are good examples of, that's the term public diplomacy belongs to the USA. So why not to really engage again into a very active, well-concentrated and coordinated activities of talking about the West and Western values, and about USA place within Europe, with Europe and with the European Union. Another task is simultaneously on the EU side, European Union. I would really think a major task would be to create a demand for the European or Western identity. And that's where all nation states, member states, together with the USA, has to work on the Western identity. It's not like revising or something, inventing, but really knowing that this is 2021, to rethink and start telling your positive narratives. So that would be my wish. Just start and do the plan, and then go operational.
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you. I hope the administration is watching and listening. Péter, over to you. Your one recommendation for the administration in Washington.
Yes, following up on that point, I think there is definitely a need for a different approach when it comes to public diplomacy, but even democracy promotion. I think that the democracy promotion activity of the United States has been extremely important since the Second World War, and it is really good that the new administration seems to rather strengthen this commitment. Still, I think the one direction knowledge transfer simply won't work anymore. So less and less partners accept in Europe, United States as, let's say, the player that teaches us how to do. So I think all the projects, all the programs should be based on cooperation and mutual exchange of experiences, and not this one direction transfer of knowledge. And one more thing, rely more on the European Union, especially the European Parliament, as an important diplomatic player.
Thank you, Péter. Maryia?
Very strangely, many of these conservative leaders in the EU capitals like the United States very much. Poland considers United States a strategic partner. So I think that the administration can actually use this leverage to try to bring them to some concessions and to bring them back to the path of a more liberal democracy. And the second recommendation is actually to do its own homework. For example, what has been happening with Radio Free Europe and Voice of America has not become the best practice example that the European Union or any other country's media market would follow. So as soon as the new administration can undo the things done within the previous administration towards the foreign voices, I think it will make them more comfortable to talk about press freedoms and freedom of expression violations in the European Union and further on.
Thank you, Maryia, and thanks to all of you for sharing your time and your analysis with us. This was great, and I hope we can continue this conversation, and also stay tuned for SIPA's CEE, Central and Eastern European Disinformation Week. Thank you all very much, and see you soon.
Thank
you.